The first time my uncle seriously talked about never working again, he didn't say, "I want to be rich." He said something much simpler. "I just want to wake up on Monday and not have to go to work." He had spent almost 35 years working. He had a house, a 401k, some money in the bank, and in his mind, he had finally reached the point where he could stop. But then he asked the question that almost everyone eventually asks: how much money would I actually need? He thought the answer was simple: $1 million, maybe $2 million, maybe even $5 million if he wanted to be completely safe. But here's the problem. There isn't one magic number that lets you walk away from work forever, because the amount you need has much less to do with your salary than most people realize. It has to do with one number you probably know every month: your spending. Imagine two Americans. One spends $40,000 a year. The other spends $100,000. They could both have the exact same salary today. They could both have the same age. They could both have the same retirement account. But they do not need the same amount of money to become financially independent, and that changes everything. Because if your goal is to never work again, you're not really asking, "How much money do I need?" You're asking, "How much money needs to exist so that my investments and other income can pay for my life?" That's a very different question. And once you understand that, the number starts becoming surprisingly simple. But there's a second question, and this one is much more dangerous. What happens if you calculate the number wrong? Because my grandfather made exactly that mistake. He believed that if he had enough money to cover today's expenses, he was safe. But retirement didn't happen in today's dollars. Prices changed, healthcare changed, his spending changed, and eventually, the number that looked comfortable on paper didn't feel nearly as comfortable in real life. That's why the real goal isn't simply reaching a large number. It's reaching a number that can survive your life. And there's a popular rule that gives us a starting point. It's called the 4% rule. The basic idea is that someone with a diversified retirement portfolio might begin by withdrawing roughly 4% of the portfolio in the first year, with later withdrawals adjusted for inflation. It's a rule of thumb, not a guarantee. Charles Schwab describes it as a starting point rather than a personalized retirement plan. And that gives us a simple thought experiment. If you wanted $40,000 a year from your investments, you'd need roughly $1 million. If you wanted $60,000, you're looking at roughly $1.5 million. And if you wanted $100,000, the number approaches $2.5 million. Suddenly, how much do I need to never work again? Becomes a much more personal question, because the answer isn't hidden in some billionaire's bank account, it's hidden in your lifestyle. But there's something most people miss. Your investments may not have to provide your entire retirement income. You could have Social Security, a pension, rental income, part-time income, other assets, and every dollar coming from those sources can reduce the amount your portfolio needs to provide. For example, if your life costs $60,000 a year, but Social Security eventually provides $25,000, your portfolio doesn't necessarily need to produce the entire $60,000. It needs to cover the gap. That's why retirement planning isn't really about finding a giant pile of money. It's about building enough reliable income to cover your life. But then comes the part my uncle hadn't thought about. He calculated his number using what he spent today, and retirement can last decades. So what happens when the grocery bill gets bigger? When insurance costs more? When property taxes rise? When healthcare becomes a larger part of the budget? And what happens if the market crashes just after you stop working? That is where the simple retirement number starts getting complicated. Because becoming financially independent isn't just about having enough money. It's about having enough money at the right time with enough flexibility to survive the things you cannot predict. And that leads to a much more important question. Maybe the goal isn't to find the biggest number you could possibly save. Maybe the goal is to find the smallest number that can actually buy you freedom. Think about that for a second. The smallest number that can buy you freedom. For one person, that might be $750,000. For another, it might be $2 million. And for someone else, even $5 million might not feel like enough. Because your financial independence number is connected to the life you're trying to protect. Consider a fictional example. Let's call her Sarah. Sarah earns $90,000 a year. If someone asks her how much she needs to retire, she might instinctively say, probably $2 million. But then we look at her actual life, She doesn't spend $90,000. She spends about $55,000. Her mortgage is almost paid off. She expects Social Security later. And she doesn't plan to travel around the world every year. Suddenly, $2 million isn't necessarily the starting point. Her real question becomes, how much of that $55,000 will come from her portfolio? How much could come from Social Security, and how much flexibility does she have if markets fall? That's a completely different calculation. Charles Schwab specifically notes that the commonly discussed 25 times rule should be applied to the amount you expect to need from your portfolio, not simply your gross income. So if your portfolio needs to provide $40,000 in the first year, a rough 25 times calculation points toward $1 million. But here's where people get into trouble. They treat the number like a finish line. I have $1 million. I'm done. That's not what the rule says. It's a planning framework. And the moment you stop working, your portfolio isn't just an account anymore. It becomes your paycheck. That changes the psychology completely. When you're working and the market falls 20%, you might feel nervous. When you're retired and the market falls 20%, you may suddenly wonder, should I stop withdrawing? Should I sell? Can I afford this? Did I retire too early? This is why my father used to say something that sounded overly cautious. Never make your retirement depend on one good year. At the time, it sounded pessimistic, but the principle was important, because the future doesn't arrive in a straight line. Markets rise, markets fall, inflation changes, your expenses change, your health can change, your family can change, and the number you thought was enough at 55 may not be the number you need at 75. There's another psychological trap too. People often think financial independence means they can spend the same amount forever. But real retirement spending isn't perfectly flat. Charles Schwab's current research emphasizes that spending plans should be reviewed over time and that actual retirement spending can change as people move through different stages of retirement. Think about a typical retiree. At 65, they may want to travel, visit family, eat out, fix the house, buy a new car. Then years later, their lifestyle may become quieter, but healthcare costs can become more important. So retirement isn't one giant 30-year vacation. It's a series of different financial seasons, and that's why there is no universal magic number. But we can still create a useful framework. Start with your annual spending. Subtract the income you expect from sources like Social Security or a pension. Then look at the remaining amount your investments would need to provide. If your portfolio needs to provide $40,000 a year, a 25 times starting point would be around $1 million. If it needs to provide $60,000, it's around $1.5 million. If it needs to provide $80,000, it's around $2 million. Those numbers aren't promises, they're starting points. And some planners choose more conservative assumptions, especially for longer retirements or different risk levels. Fidelity, for example, has discussed a more conservative 33 times approach with a 3% withdrawal rate for financial independence planning. So now we have two very different ideas. One person asks, how can I get to $2 million? The smarter question may be, how can I make my required number smaller? And that changes the entire game, because earning more helps, investing helps, saving more helps. But reducing the amount of money you permanently need every year can be incredibly powerful. And that is where financial independence becomes less about becoming rich and more about becoming difficult to financially break. But there's still one problem. The number on your investment statement doesn't tell you whether you can actually stop working. Your timing matters, your expenses matter, taxes matter, healthcare matters, Social Security matters, and the market matters. Which means the most dangerous retirement mistake might not be retiring with too little money. It might be believing you have enough, because one number told you so. So let's return to the question, how much money would you need to never work again? The uncomfortable answer is, it depends. But it depends doesn't mean you can't calculate it. It means you calculate it from your life instead of someone else's. Start with what you actually spend, not what you earn, not what your neighbor spends. Not what some millionaire on the internet says you need, you're spending. Then separate the expenses you absolutely need from the expenses you could reduce if the market had a terrible year. because flexibility can be worth just as much as another $100,000 in the portfolio. Imagine two retirees with $1.5 million. The first has fixed expenses of $70,000 a year and almost no flexibility. The second spends $50,000, but could temporarily cut that to $40,000 if markets collapsed. They have the same portfolio, but they don't have the same level of financial risk. The second person has something incredibly valuable: options. And options are what make financial independence powerful. You don't necessarily need enough money to guarantee that nothing bad ever happens. You need enough money and enough flexibility to handle what happens when life doesn't go according to plan. That's why the phrase, "never work again," can actually be misleading. Financial independence doesn't have to mean you will never earn another dollar. It can mean you never again have to work because you're terrified of running out of money. You could work part-time, start a small business, consult, create something. Or simply choose work because you want to, not because your mortgage depends on Friday's paycheck. That's a completely different kind of freedom. And there's one more lesson my grandfather's mistake taught our family. Don't confuse a large number with security. $1 million sounds enormous, but if you spend $100,000 every year, it represents a very different situation than if you spend $40,000. And $2 million can feel completely different depending on whether your house is paid off, whether you have other income, how long retirement may last, and how much flexibility you have. That is why the popular 4% rule should be treated as a starting point, not a guarantee. Schwab's current guidance explicitly emphasizes adjusting a withdrawal strategy for factors such as time horizon, portfolio mix, taxes, other income, and changing spending needs. And maybe that's the biggest realization. You don't need to know exactly what the stock market will do 20 years from now. You don't need to predict the next recession. You don't need to know exactly how long you're going to live. You need a plan that can adapt. Because the real definition of wealth isn't simply having enough money to buy everything you want. It's having enough control over your money that you can make decisions without fear. My uncle eventually stopped asking, "How much do I need to become rich?" He started asking a better question. How much do I need so that my life doesn't depend on my next paycheck? That question changed everything, because once you know your number, you can start working toward it. And maybe your number isn't $5 million, maybe it's $2 million, maybe it's $1 million, maybe it's less, or maybe you discover you need more. The important part is that the number should come from your life, not from somebody else's. Because financial independence isn't about reaching a magical number and suddenly becoming free. It's about building enough financial strength that work becomes a choice. And if you can reach that point, you don't just buy a retirement, you buy options, you buy time, and ultimately, you buy the freedom to decide what happens next. If you want more documentaries about the money decisions shaping America's future, subscribe to MSBT Finance.